Okay, well, we come back finally to church history. It's been the last class on church history was April the 13th, so that's been about 3 months. What today is actually is July the 13th. So let me just remind us, I think, briefly of where we left off. You may remember we're in what's been called the modern church period, the period of church history that usually is. It's dated from the mid 1600s when you're talking about Europe after the Peace of Westphalia, and the modern period is dated as beginning. Whether you look at it, the English Civil War or the Glorious Revolution later in 1689. From that time forward is called the modern period of church history by whoever makes up those decisions and decides that that's what is called. So, which of course can be further subdivided into other things. And lately we've been considering the great revivals of the 18th century in England, Wales, Scotland, and America. And after considering the Great Awakening in America, we then considered the Second Great Awakening in America, which began roughly 15 years after the Revolutionary War and really spanned a period of 2 and on into 3 decades, the first 3 decades, mainly the first 2, but also you could say into the 3rd decade of the 1800s, the 19th century. A long period of repeated revivals in diverse locations, sometimes widespread with ebbs and flows. And we looked at many of the good things that happened in the Second Great Awakening, as well as some negative influences that began to creep in. But then there was one final widespread spiritual awakening in the English-speaking world we just touched on that occurred in the 19th century, and that's the revival of 1857 to 58, which we briefly considered. You may remember one of the roots of that revival was a prayer meeting that began to be held in New York City, but this awakening really happened on the other side of the Atlantic as well, in Northern Ireland, Scotland, England, and Wales. And so that's where we left off. So we're now poised to move to the Civil War and to the post-Civil War period of church history in America. But before we do that, I want to back up. And we've been kind of really focusing on the revivals of the 18th century and early 19th century, mid-19th century. And I want to back up and for us to look at least a couple of other things, a couple of major positive developments that occurred in the 19th century. The first is the modern missionary movement of the 19th century. And secondly, we'll cross back over the Atlantic, God willing, to England, and I want to consider the life and ministry of Charles Spurgeon. So we begin the day with the modern missionary movement, and I'll be drawing a lot from Dave Merrick's treatment of this period. Also, when we consider William Carey, I'll be drawing some from Michael Haken's biography of William Carey. Now, of course, when addressing the history of missions, we could go all the way back to the book of Acts, right? And then we could also trace the missionary efforts of the church through the early church period and during the Middle Ages. I'm not planning to do that. Our focus will be on early efforts during the Reformation, and then we'll primarily focus on the great surge of missionary zeal and effort in the English-speaking world that grew out of the 17th and 18th century, 18th and 19th century revivals, what's sometimes called the modern missionary movement, all right? But we're going to begin, first of all, with some early missionary efforts and endeavors during and immediately after the Reformation. I think it can be argued, and I think it can be fairly argued, that it was of necessity that the focus of the early reformers was on what we might call home missions. Parts of Europe were just emerging from the errors and the heresies of Romanism, and the circumstances demanded that most of their work involved preaching the gospel to their own regions, establishing the people in the truth, and reforming the churches. And so I think when we look at the circumstances of the time, it's quite understandable, and really that was really where their focus tended to be and needed to be. However, there were men who ventured out of their own country to preach the gospel in other parts of Europe as the Reformation progressed. We learned when we studied Calvin about the ministerial academy in Geneva. Many men, many who had been religious refugees, were trained there at that academy, then sent out to other parts of Europe, including France, Germany, Holland, Scotland, and England. And also during the Reformation, there were early plans and attempts to take the gospel to areas beyond Europe. Let me just give a summary of some of those attempts. First, again, there were early efforts at foreign missions in Calvin's Geneva. In 1555, Calvin reportedly sent out 14 missionaries to Brazil as part of a group of French Huguenot colonists who sought to settle there near present-day Rio de Janeiro. And this attempted settlement was an attempt. There were 14 missionaries sent out with this group, but the settlement it failed, and it ended by 1559. Additional Huguenot colonies were attempted in what is now Florida and South Carolina during the last half of the 1500s, but none of them lasted very long. Secondly, there were efforts by Dutch Protestants. After the Dutch pushed the Portuguese and the Spanish out of the East Indies, they became really the dominant country there commercially during the 1600s. The East Indies includes the Philippines, Indonesia, Borneo, Papua New Guinea, Malaysia, and historically that's also been used to describe the coast of the Indian subcontinent, also the Indochina Peninsula, that would include modern-day Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, Thailand, Myanmar. Well, after gaining dominance in that region, the Dutch established their headquarters on the island of Java, and what was named the East India Company, at least in this period, actively supported missionary efforts. There was also a strong Dutch Protestant foothold in the southern tip of Africa, where the first settlement was established in 1652, and there were some early missionary efforts there as well. There were also missionary efforts by the Dutch in Brazil and in northeastern South America. What about the British? Well, the first British colony in North America was established in St. John's, Newfoundland in 1583, and one of its main goals was to carry, quote, God's word into these very mighty and vast countries. Many of you have heard of Pocahontas. How many of you have heard of Pocahontas? Okay. Well, Pocahontas is the daughter of an Indian chief, and she was actually converted to Christ through her contacts with the permanent English settlement established at Jamestown, Virginia in 1607. The first two charters of this colony, and these are things you probably don't learn in your history class at a public school or public high school, but the first two charters of this colony called for the propagation of the Christian faith to those still living in darkness. Efforts were made to reach the Indians dwelling in Virginia, including the establishment of a college to teach the Christian faith to Indian children. And also the first charter of the Puritan colony of Massachusetts. And again, this is something you probably aren't told in your history classes in a secular university or in high school, but the first charter of the Puritan colony of Massachusetts declared that the royal purpose of the colony included efforts for the conversion of the native Indians. In fact, the seal of the colonists had on it a North American Indian with these words coming out of his mouth in the seal, "Come over and help us." And you may recognize that this is a quotation from Paul's Macedonian call in Acts chapter 16. And although several men would labor among the Indians of New England, the best known is John Eliot, who lived from 1604 to 1690. He arrived in Massachusetts in 1631. He would have been roughly 27 years old. He arrived there to minister to English settlers. However, several years later, at the age of 40, he began to study Algonquin, the language of the Indians of Massachusetts. And at the end of his notebook, in which he had mastered the intricacies of the Indian grammar, he wrote, "Prayers and pains through faith in Jesus Christ will do anything." And indeed, he finished a complete translation of the Bible into the English language in 1664. And by the time he died in 1690, he lived a long time. Before he died in 1690, there were 1,100 Indian Christians who were members of 6 churches, with one having an Indian minister. Also, a small college was established at Harvard, which itself was small and in its fledgling days, but a small college was established there to train Indian pastors and teachers. As a result of the labors of Eliot and others, and of the printing of a series of missionary tracts, in fact, in England, beginning in 1643, the Long Parliament of the Puritan Interregnum. You remember, the Puritan Interregnum is language describing that period when there was no monarch, when England was a commonwealth governed by Parliament and by Cromwell as the Lord Protector. Well, in 1649, they established the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in New England to assist this work of reaching the Indians in New England. And by the time of the restoration of the monarchy in 1660, nearly 16,000 pounds had been contributed from all parts of England to this early evangelical missionary society. Cromwell even laid plans to divide the world into 4 great missionary fields. And it seemed as if the English were on the threshold of a worldwide missionary effort, but the restoration of the monarchy and the suppression of the missionary-minded Puritans greatly hindered and delayed those efforts. In 1698, an Anglican minister, Thomas Bray, founded the Society for Promoting Christian Knowledge. Later, he formed a second society, the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in Foreign Parts. In 1709, the Society in Scotland for Propagating Christian Knowledge was founded. And then as you move into the Evangelical Awakening in England and the Great Awakening in America in the late 1730s and early 40s, not only were the churches revived, there was also a revival of interest in missions. Most of us have heard of David Brainerd, the great missionary to the Indians, primarily in the frontier areas of New Jersey from 1743. It's hard for us to think of New Jersey ever being a frontier area, but it was at that time, and he labored among the Indians there in 1743 to 1747 before he died of tuberculosis in the home of Jonathan Edwards. His journals were later published by Edwards, and they were greatly used, and they still are, to stir up the hearts of many young men for the work of missions. Edwards himself, after he was forced to leave Northampton, labored for 7 years as a missionary to the Mohican and Mohawk Indians in what was then the frontier regions of western Massachusetts. In 1741, the Society for the Furtherance of the Gospel was established in London, England. And we could go on. There were efforts by the Swedish minister John Campanius, who came to modern-day Delaware in 1643. He also studied the Indian language there and engaged in efforts to reach them with the gospel. The same was the case with a Swedish Lutheran pastor in Delaware in the early 1700s. But probably the most ambitious missionary efforts before we get to what's called the modern missionary movement were those of the German Pietists. You may remember we learned a little bit about them. It's been a while, and especially the Moravians who eventually became associated with the German Pietists, though that's not actually their roots. After the bloody 30 Years' War, which ended in 1648, there was a period really of vibrant spiritual life in the German Lutheran Church. However, this was followed in the next generation by serious spiritual decline. And it was at this time that there began to arise what has been called the Pietist movement. And we consider this in some detail in our study of church history way back. Philip Jacob Spiner, who lived from 1638 to 1705, he began to emphasize instruction in the Scriptures and devotional exercises and small groups meeting together to study the Scriptures. This began to occur, and the instruction of young people became a major focus, and there began to be a group of very serious-minded individuals and people that was formed as a result of this, and they were derisively labeled as the Pietists. And that's the origin of the description. Again, like the terms Puritan and Methodist, it was originally meant to be a put-down. It was a way of calling them, religious fanatics, Pietists. A university was eventually founded in Hall or Hawley in 1695, and it became the center of the Pietists. Another prominent member of this spiritual awakening that we learned a little bit about way back was August Hermann Frank. You'll probably come across his name if you read church history at all from time to time. Well, missionaries were sent out from Hawley, beginning with two who were sent out by the request of the Danish king to Danish colonies in India in 1705. There had been earlier plans and kind of feeble attempts, but this marked the first serious and to some degree at least effective Protestant effort to reach Indians in India with the gospel. The English Society for Promoting Christian Knowledge helped in this effort. Remember, these people are in Germany, but the English Society for Promoting Christian Knowledge helped to give financial support to this effort. And by the close of the 18th century, there were between 18,000 to 20,000 professing Christians who were attached to this missionary enterprise in India. One prominent man who was trained at Hawley was Count von Zinzendorf. You may have heard of him. In 1722, on his estate in Saxony, he gave shelter to Moravian brethren who were descendants of the followers of John Huss. Maybe you remember John Huss. We studied the Reformation. He's kind of viewed as kind of the precursor to Martin Luther. He was a century before, but had said many of the same things and was burned at the stake. But there were followers of John Huss that continued on, the Moravians. And so these Moravians sought shelter at Zinzendorf gave shelter to some of these Moravian refugees, you might call them. And Lutherans, Calvinists, and Hussites all gathered at this new settlement called Herrnhut. Zinzendorf, one way you may have heard of him, is he composed a lot of really good hymns. In fact, one that we sing a lot in our church, Jesus, Thy Blood and Righteousness, that was written by Count von Zinzendorf. And he was a man who was fired with missionary zeal by the example of the Pietist missionaries at Hawley. And in 1732, the first Moravian missionaries left for the West Indies. Now, the West Indies includes Cuba, Jamaica, Hispaniola, which is now divided into two countries, Dominican Republic and Haiti, Puerto Rico, and other islands in that region. And these missionaries were the first of many Moravians to go far and wide into various parts of the world, including Greenland, Russia, Ceylon, India, Algiers, Labrador, Persia, Egypt, and what is today, it was Abyssinia, I think, in those days, but today it's called Ethiopia. Perhaps you remember also that it was Moravian missionaries who had such a profound impact upon John Wesley when he went to Georgia. You remember he came in contact, and when he was on the ship returning, and there was the huge storm, and the Moravians, you remember, were singing hymns and were calm, and he was so afraid. And he connected with some of them when he got back to England, and it was from the Moravians, really, that he learned the doctrine of justification by faith. Now, the missionary efforts of the Moravians were often short-lived and without a whole lot of fruit, but their efforts were to go on to inspire many others, including the man who is often referred to as the founder of the modern missionary movement, William Carey, which we'll be looking at him in a moment. Well, I wanted to go over all of this before we get to Carey and others in the 19th century to help us to see that a missionary burden and missionary zeal did not start with the modern missionary movement. Sometimes we might get that impression, as if Carey and others of his time were the first missionaries, or that they were the first Protestant Christians to be serious about missions and to care about missions or to do missions. And I hope you see that it's wrong to think that. You might hear someone say, well, the Reformers were great, but the Reformers didn't care about missions. Or you may hear someone say the Puritans didn't care about missions. Well, that's absolutely not true. That's not accurate. to history. There was a lot of missionary concern and effort from the very beginning of the Reformation right on through the Puritan era and into the 18th century. Now, circumstances were different. They labored in different times and circumstances. The Puritans were enmeshed in a battle in England to reform the church that eventually led to a civil war and all that they were involved in. And often there were other important battles that they were fighting in those generations, but there was always a concern, at least among many, for the gospel to be taken to those who had never heard of Christ. In fact, an interesting book to read about the Puritan concern about missions and zeal for the spread of the gospel is Ian Murray's little book, The Puritan Hope, in which he lays that out and the theological basis of it. It's very, very, very good. But as we come to the 19th century, it is true that these efforts greatly increase and become more widespread. So we move now from these early efforts and endeavors in the 17th and 18th centuries, the 19th century, to the 19th century, and to the modern missionary movement, part 2. And we begin with the life and labors of William Carey. And here again, I'll be drawing a lot from Michael Haken's biography of William Carey that we just recently read in our family worship, as well as other Dave Merrick's lectures as well. Now, Carey is commonly called the father of the modern missionary movement, and for that reason, we need to know about him. And we should be interested in him. And there's another reason that we should be interested in Carey, is because he was a Reformed Baptist. Now, they were called particular Baptists in those days, but they were what we are, Reformed Baptists. He was part of those Calvinistic Baptists in England who held to the 1689 London Baptist Confession of Faith as their doctrinal standard. Well, to understand Carey and his importance, first we need to understand something of the background of his life and work. And this will be a review of a lot of things, some things that we've considered, a brief review, some of the things we've considered in our study of the evangelical revival, and we looked at its influence upon the particular Baptists. You may remember that by the time of the awakening in the 1740s, the particular Baptists were in a state of decline. And we also saw that their initial reaction to the revival, at least with respect to many of them, was not positive. And we saw that there were several reasons for this, but one of them, you may remember, was the chilling effect of hyper-Calvinism that had crept into the thinking of some of their churches. The hallmark of hyper-Calvinism is the rejection of the free offer of the gospel to all men. It's the belief that preachers should not give indiscriminate invitations and exhortations to sinners to believe the gospel, to come to Christ, and to come to Christ immediately. They should preach the gospel message, the facts of the gospel, yes, but they were against gospel offers. Or some of them believe that Christ should only be offered to those who showed signs of being elect, a certain measure of conviction of sin, seeking sinners or sensible sinners who were convicted of their sins, and so on. The hyper-Calvinist rightly sees the doctrines of grace, unconditional election, particular redemption, human depravity and inability. He rightly sees those in the Scriptures. But then on the basis of that, he rejects or minimizes human responsibility and the sincere, well-meant offer of the gospel of Christ to all. On the other hand, biblical Calvinism, or what is sometimes called evangelical Calvinism, embraces both of these truths because it believes that both are taught in the Bible. The evangelical Calvinist recognizes that there is a tension in the Bible our puny minds are not able to fully reconcile. There is mystery here because we are dealing with an infinite God. And as you can imagine, hyper-Calvinism tends to squelch evangelistic and missionary zeal in the church. But eventually we also learned there began to be a change among the particular Baptists. There arose a new generation of pastors, many of whom had been converted during the revival under the ministries of men like George Whitefield. Also in the latter half of the 18th century, there was a group of Baptists who were very much influenced by the writings of Jonathan Edwards, and his writings had helped to lead them out of hyper-Calvinistic thinking. And one of them was a man named Andrew Fuller, who wrote extensively in refutation of hyper-Calvinism while also promoting a warm evangelical Calvinism marked by a zeal for preaching the gospel to the unconverted. And we learned a lot about him in an earlier lesson. And Fuller was part of a band of like-minded brothers, a group of close Baptist ministerial friends made up of John Sutcliffe, John Ryland Jr., and Samuel Pierce, men who also became close, lifelong friends with William Carey. So this is something of the background. Now let's consider Carey's early life. William Carey was born in 1761 to poor parents in a small village in Northamptonshire, England. The village was called Paulersperry. His father was a weaver. He operated his hand loom in his own cottage. A lot of people had cottage industries in those days, and he was a weaver. He made a type of woolen cloth. When Carey was 6 years old, his father was appointed the parish clerk of Paulersperry. It was a Church of England congregation, and the parish clerk was the guy who pronounced the amen to the prayers and announced the sermon. He also led the chants and responses during the service and had other responsibilities. So William was often taken to church, worshiping in an Anglican congregation. Also living in Paulersperry was William's uncle, Peter Carey, who worked as a gardener. And Peter implanted in William as a young person a love for gardening, and that was to stay with him his whole life. Even after he went to India, he had these wonderful gardens that he had constructed and took care of. He loved gardening so much that he wanted to become a gardener like his uncle, but he suffered from a skin disease, and that skin disease made it very painful for him to be out in the sun for any length of time, and therefore instead of becoming a gardener, when his former schooling ended at age 12, his father apprenticed him to a shoemaker, and this was to become his trade. Well, while he was working as an apprentice, and here we see the providence of God. You know, what seems to be a disappointment in our lives is often, in God's providence, He has a purpose for it, a good purpose. While he was an apprentice there, one of his fellow apprentices was a genuine Christian. His name was John Warr. He was a Congregationalist, and this was the man that God used to bring Carey to Christ. And it's an example of how important our personal, private witness is to people. You never know. That person you're witnessing to, if they come to faith in Christ, you don't know what they may do in their lives and the kind of domino effect that occurs. And so this man was witnessing to Carey. Quoting now from Michael Haykin, at first when Warr spoke with Carey about Christ, Carey resisted the force of his arguments. Carey was the product of a staunch Anglican home and had come to despise anyone who was not a member of this denomination. But as Warr continued to witness to Carey, the latter felt, quote, a growing uneasiness and stings of conscience gradually increasing. Carey said, Warr lent him books that began to affect a change in his thinking, but which also increased his, quote, inward uneasiness. Warr also persuaded him to attend a prayer meeting with him, where a number gathered for midweek prayer and Bible study. Carey subsequently tried to reform his life, to give up lying and swearing, which is something he did a lot. He was addicted to swearing and using bad language and so forth. And he tried to give up lying and swearing, to take up prayer, but he later said he had no idea that, quote, nothing but a complete change of heart could do him any real and lasting good. And then together with the witnessing of John Warr, Carey had a traumatic experience in which he got caught in an act of dishonesty and deception in commerce. And he was covered with shame and disgrace. By this means, Carey was led, he subsequently said, quote, to see much more of myself than I had ever done before, and to seek mercy with greater earnestness. And that mercy he found as over the next 2 years, he came, in his own words, to depend on a crucified Savior for pardon and salvation. At the urging of his friends, he was attending, I think, a congregational church, the church where John Warr was, I believe, at this time. And at the urging of his friends, he began to preach around 1781. But then shortly after that, having embraced Baptist principles, he was baptized and he became a member of a Baptist church. He's still working as a shoemaker. And while he's working as a shoemaker, his interest in missions is stirred up by a number of things, but one of them was reading, especially his reading of Captain Cook's voyages. And learning and reading Captain Cook's account of his voyages and the many peoples that he met in these different regions of the world, that helped to stir up his interest in consideration of the fact that these people were in darkness and did not have the light of the gospel. He also, he never went on to he never had like a seminary training or anything like that. But the guy was clearly a genius. He showed great aptitude with languages. He soon taught himself Greek, and he mastered the Greek language. He also taught himself to read French and Dutch. He began learning Latin and Hebrew. He was self-taught, and he did this while still operating his shoemaker business, preaching on the side, and taking care of his family. He had married Dorothy Packet. In 1781, she was the illiterate daughter of a member of the Baptist Church. In 1784, Carey became lay pastor of a little Baptist church at Moulton near Kettering, where he had to supplement his income by teaching school and making boots. He became exposed to the writings of Andrew Fuller, and after reading Andrew Fuller, supposing probably his comment here is about Andrew Fuller's book, The Gospel Worthy of All Acceptation, in which he refutes hyper-Calvinism and supports from Scripture the necessity of preaching the gospel to all. Carey concluded, "If it be the duty of all men when the gospel comes to believe unto salvation, then it is the duty of those who are entrusted with the gospel to endeavor to make it known among all nations for the obedience of faith." So here's where his mind is going now. On one occasion, he was teaching a geography lesson at his school, and there's an anecdote that as he was doing so, he was moved to tears as he pointed to various lands on a crude map, and he cried out, "And these are pagans, pagans." In 1787, Carey was officially ordained as a minister at Moulton, with John Ryland and Andrew Fuller taking part in the service. He's now become acquainted with these men, and they've become friends. These men became very close friends, lifelong friends. He was now able to meet and discuss concerns with fellow pastors in the Northamptonshire Association. And on such occasions, Carey would often speak about trying to take the gospel to the heathen lands. And in his appeals, they weren't always well received. And there were different arguments. We got enough to do here at home. Some even argued that the Great Commission was given to the apostles. It wasn't given to us. It was directed to the apostles and so on, that it had already been fulfilled. There was I guess you could call a hyper-preterist view of the Great Commission that some people had, that was already fulfilled by the apostles in the first generation. He met up with some of these kinds of arguments. In 1791, he published a pamphlet entitled An Inquiry into the Obligation of Christians to Use Means for the Conversion of the Heathen. And in that pamphlet, he demonstrated that the Great Commission did not apply only to the apostles, as some had argued. There are many arguments against that idea. One of those, even in the text itself, is Jesus, after he gives the Great Commission, says, "And lo, I will be with you even to the end of the age." There were many other arguments that he drew from. And he made the proposal for the association to establish a society to carry out the Great Commission. The historian Legg, John Legg, I believe is his name, he describes what happened soon after. 3 weeks after the publication of the inquiry, he preached his famous Nottingham sermon to the association on the text from Isaiah 54, "Enlarge the place of thy tent, and let them stretch forth the curtains of their habitations. Spare not, lengthen thy cords, and strengthen thy stakes." And he opened that up in its context, its prophetic context, and his two headings were "Expect great things from God, attempt great things for God." Actually, those were not his two headings. This is what you often hear, that those were his two headings, but actually it was just "Expect great things, attempt great things." That was the two headings of his sermon. And this was in May of 1792. When the ministers met the next morning, the matter was not even mentioned. And Carey turned to Fuller, implored him, "Is there nothing again going to be done?" Fuller was shaken into responding, and being a man of influence, his support resulted in the passing of a resolution that, quote, "a plan be prepared against the next ministers' meeting at Kettering for forming a Baptist society for propagating the gospel among the heathen." And this meeting happened in Kettering in October. This was in May. It happened in October 1792. And it just happened that day. It was really, really bad weather that day. And Carey had to travel 20 miles to get to Kettering. And Fuller, in the months between the previous meeting in May, when they made the resolution to meet together to do this, had had terrible experiences, trials in his life. A few days after he returned from that previous meeting, his wife began to experience bouts of insanity. In his own words, in a letter to his friend John Ryland, she became as destitute of reason as an infant. And she became convinced that Fuller was not her husband, that he was an impostor who had entered their house, taken possession of every place and all that belonged to her and her husband. Then she was convinced that she was no longer at home, and the doors of the house had to be kept locked because she kept trying to escape. And on top of that, she was pregnant. After 2 weeks, she delivered the child, a daughter. Fuller called her Bathoni, and she recovered her senses for a little over 12 hours. She seemed like she was back to her old self. And then suddenly, while they were eating dinner, her mind was gone again, and she remained in that state until her death a few hours later on August 23rd. And so now, while he's beset with this terrible grief over the loss of his wife, Fuller found himself having to provide leadership for what was to be an unprecedented step among the Calvinistic Baptists, the founding of a missionary society. Again, the weather was bad that day. After the public services were completed, Fuller and 13 other men, including 11 pastors, Carey among them, a deacon from Fuller's congregation, there was a ministerial student there as well, they all crowded into the parlor of the home of Martha Wallace. She was a widow who had been a long-standing member of the church in Kettering. And now this parlor that they were in was only 12 by 10. It was a little small little room, maybe comfortable enough for 4 men to actually sit in and to spread out their legs comfortably. But there were 14 men crammed in that little room. Among them, together with Fuller and Carey, were John Sutcliffe and Samuel Pierce, and there they formed what they called the Particular Baptist Society for Propagating the Gospel Among the Heathen. It would later be named the Baptist Missionary Society. And in order to help get the effort started and to finance the effort, they each pledged to give a small sum, and Fuller passed around a snuff box. It's like a chewing tobacco box, like a skull box, except snuff's more finely ground. He's passed around a snuff box to collect the pledges in it. And the total amounted to only 13 pounds, 2 shillings, and 6 pence, which was a very, very, very small sum to try to launch a missionary enterprise. And Haken makes the comment, it was truly a case of God choosing what is weak in the world to shame the wise. 1 Corinthians 1:27. An executive committee was appointed, including Ryland, Carey, and Sutcliffe, with Fuller as secretary. And that was a position he held until his death in 1815. And Carey would soon, quoting Merrick, put his feet where his mouth was, as he became the first missionary to be sent out by the new society. And we're going to learn about that next week. And he was the one of many that was sent out by this society to various parts of the world to preach the gospel. Despise not the day of small things, right? God bless their concern and their effort. This little group of men who remained lifelong friends. Even after Carey went to India, they exchanged many, many letters between one another, and they supported him and prayed for him and raised money for his efforts.